Well, hey there everyone, and welcome back to Stuff in Excel. I'm Richard, and what I want to do in this video is talk about the basics of pivot tables. If you're like me, the first time you ever heard about a pivot table, you were probably at a conference or at a meeting or maybe at a party and other people are talking about them, and everybody else seemed to know what they were and you didn't have a clue. But you knew that you didn't want to say anything because you didn't want to look like the one that didn't have a clue, right? So what we're going to do is take a look at the basics of pivot tables here. We're going to look at what a basic pivot table is, how to create one, and how to manipulate some of the variables within a pivot table. I think it's going to be really helpful. Let's just jump into it. So let's start our conversation about pivot tables by taking a look at this data. Now this data is available to you by clicking on the link in the description to this video that you see below. You can download this file and then follow along with everything we're going to do. So if I get this data, now this is only about 12 lines of data. Imagine what would happen if you had, 12,000 lines of this data and you needed to be able to analyze it and pick it apart. Maybe you just wanted to look at the East Division or the Central Division or the West Division, or you just wanted to look at the F-150s or the F-250s or the F-350s. Maybe you just wanted to look at sales and not cost of goods sold or gross margin. How do you do that with this data very easily? Well, in its current form, this data is not in a form that allows us to do a lot of manipulation, allows us to cut or slice this data in different ways. However, there's a tool in Excel called a pivot table, and I've got a video that sort of explains what pivot tables are, but let's just go over a brief explanation here. A pivot table in its simplest form is a tool built into Excel that allows you to very quickly, easily, and efficiently look at the data in the way that you want to look at it. You can summarize it, you can filter stuff out, you can chart it. There's a lot of different things you can do through the pivot table function. And what I want to show you right here is the basics of how to do a pivot table. So the first step in building any kind of pivot table would be to identify the data that you want to include in that pivot table. Now there's a couple of ways to do that in Excel. One way would be to take the data here and to convert it to a table. So we know how to do that. You simply click on the data and highlight it. Then you go up to Insert in the upper left on your ribbon, and we're going to go to Insert. And if you click Insert, one of the options is Table. And when you click on Table, it's going to give you an option over here, Create the Table. And you want to tell it that the table does have headers. You say OK, and it's going to convert the format of this table. Now, in this table design area, you can pick the colors you want. I always like to have my headers in black type. So I always choose one of these that has sort of a black type on it, something like that maybe. But that gives my data a look, and it's in a table. Now, in a table, there's some features of a table that I'm not going to go through them here, but I want you to remember that each one of these now has a filter. I can filter through this, so I can look at each of the divisions. Like if I just wanted to look at, say, Central Division, I can do that. I can look at all the divisions by clicking on the Select All button. I can, each of the data, it always does this thing where it gives you different color bands to help delineate the data. But each one of these columns has a filter on it. In addition, if I add anything to this, like if I added the North, for example, and I added F-150, and let's say I sold 1,000 of those, and I sold them at, let's say that's 1,000 at $50,000 a piece. Well, I didn't actually put it in a formula format, did I? Equals 1,000, times $50,000 a piece. And so that's that. And then let's say I have 1,000. Let's say our cost is let's say times, let's say it's $26,000 to make one. I don't know. I'm making it up. Now, I didn't get anything over in this column because it's not a formula, right? So, but if this had been a formula, it would have automatically copied that formula over for me. So now I've got this here, and now that's in a formula format. If I put in, let's say I do North, and it's the F-250, and we only sold 100 of those, sold those at $60,000 a piece. Whoops. They cost $32,000 each to make. It also doesn't copy that because it's going to pick up what the original formatting was, right? But if this had originally been a formula, we would have seen that it would have copied that formula right down the page, and we wouldn't have had to worry about it. So let's take those two lines out, and let's go back to our original format, which was a non-table format for this data. And there it is. Now, another way to do this is simply to click anywhere in this data. So as long as your data is all connected, in other words, there's no blank columns and no blank rows, I click anywhere in this block of data, and Excel is going to recognize this is what we call a contiguous block of data. Everything from A1 down to F13 is in the same block of data. I don't have to highlight it. I don't have to make it into a table. If I click there, Excel is going to recognize that entire section of data as a block of data that we want Excel to work with. So once we've got this, the next thing is to create our pivot table. And the way we do that, we're going to go back up to our Insert button. And we're going to, this time, instead of clicking on Table, we're going to go over all the way to the left and click on Pivot Table. And when I click on Pivot Table, it gives me this box over here. It tells me I've selected this range. Okay, it picked up the range that I wanted it to. I now want to put it. Let's put it on this. Let's put it on a new worksheet just for the fun of it. And I'll hit OK. So when I hit OK, it's going to create a new screen that you may or may not have seen before. And it's going to look like this. So I haven't done anything yet. I haven't created any formats. I haven't created any tables. But I can. Using the Pivot Tables fields over here on the right, I can decide what I want. If I want in the rows, let's say I want in my rows, I want division in my rows. And then what I want is I want sales over here in my values. When I do that, you'll notice over here to the far left, it has now created a table for me. And that table has got central, sales, sales for the east, and sales for the west. Now, it doesn't tell me each individual model, but I didn't ask it to tell me that. Now, I can add a filter. If I go back over here and I drag units, or product, down to filter, it has now created a filter up here for me for product. And when I click on that filter for product, it gives me a bunch of options. And I could look at just the F-150. And that's going to now give me different numbers. Or I can go look at the let's say I want to look at the F-250. And it's going to give me those numbers. Those are going to be different. Alternatively, I could look at a selection of those. I could look at all of them. I could select multiple items at once by clicking on which ones I want to click on. Or I can just click the All button, and it'll click all of them, and I'm back to my original table. So I've got a filter built into this table. So I can create summary tables now that I could not create before I had a pivot table. In addition, I can change what I'm looking at, or I can add to this. So let's say I want to now add cost of goods sold to this. I drag that down to my columns area or my values area. And son of a gun, it added cost of goods sold to that. And I can add gross margin to that as well. And there it is. I've got the sum of sales for Central, East, and West divisions, sum of cost of goods sold, and sum of gross margin for all of those. And I've got a grand total. So that's essentially a very simple, easy way to create a table of data that you can manipulate and use to summarize and select and filter the data that you have available to you. So there are a couple of other things we can do with this pivot table. So let me sort of undo some of this stuff. I'm going to take the filter out. Now the way I do that, I come back over to Pivot Fields. I just click on that filter and I drag it up. I can also unclick it above, and I'm going to do that with division. I'm going to take it out of rows. This time, let's put product down here in the rows. And we can now see that we've got the different products all illustrated here, but I don't know if that's the total for all the divisions. But I don't know if, in fact, that's what I really want. I want to know maybe what it is for the East Division or the West Division. So how can I figure that out? Well, I can, again, do a filter if I wish, and that puts that filter up there. But alternatively, we can do another thing. I can drag this division down and put it with product. Now what I've got for each product, I can see what the sales are for that division. And you notice it's got a subtotal at the top. Now it's a little odd to see the subtotals at the top. There's actually a tool we can use to move those subtotals to the bottom where we're more used to seeing them, but we'll get into that later in the course. But what we see here is we can, in fact, if I go back over here, I can switch the order of product and division, and I can now do this by division by product. So now I've got each division and the product sales within that. And now this begins to look very similar to the table we had earlier, right? But what I can do is, again, I can switch these things around. I can look at this data differently than I was looking at it before, and it gives me a lot of flexibility. It allows me to go through this process and to look at the data the way I want to look at it, and as opposed to the way it was presented in the original data form. So hopefully this was helpful to you. Hopefully you can see now how to create a basic pivot table. You want to go in and fiddle with it some, get used to using it, sort of experiment with different ways to show different things the way you want to show them. But as we go through, as I've got other videos, we'll show you how to do other tips and tricks with pivot tables to make them look better and make them do the things you need them to do. Now, if you like this video, we'd love for it to have you subscribe to the channel. Otherwise, we'll see you real soon here on Stuff in Excel.